individuals in an attempt to coerce the women and Warren Crutcher into telling the defendant where the drugs and money and guns were located. The proof will show that when the victims, including Warren Crutcher, either were unable to tell the defendant what he wanted to know or refused to tell the defendant what he wanted to know, the defendant murdered all 6 of these individuals, and he did it right here in Lincoln County. All right, let me back up and talk about a few other things. First of all, I want to thank you for enduring the voir dire last week. I'm sure that was mind-numbing. I tell the grand jury that we have here once a month that if you made me come to your work and sit there all day and listen to your problems, it wouldn't be very much fun and I wouldn't enjoy it. So thank you for enduring that last week, and hopefully from here on out it'll be a little bit more entertaining or something to you can take notes or do something else, I guess. As you know, the state and the defendant have a right to an unbiased jury, and that's why we have you in this case sequestered, and we appreciate you for enduring that as well. As Judge Gerards mentioned, this portion of the trial is called the opening statement. The opening statement is our first opportunity, or the first opportunity for the lawyers to get to tell you what the case is about. Now, you may have seen this on TV. This is the part of the trial, or a trial, that is probably closer to what you've seen on TV before. But let me just tell you quickly, an opening statement could be like that part of the book. If you would go to, you remember bookstores, I used to have them. We've still got some here. If you go to a book and you go to the back of the book, there's that blurb, and it tells you, doesn't tell you the whole points of the book, but it'll give you an example or a summary of what's going to be in there. Well, that's what opening statement is. All right. Another way to describe that would be if you went, and I've got children and I've bought them puzzles at Walmart or at the store or wherever. Well, you can't necessarily just look at the box and see exactly where every piece is, or perhaps you don't see any of the pieces and you see a whole picture. Well, the outside of the box, though, gives you an idea of what it is you're going to have on the inside, right? And it'll tell you you're going to have 100 pieces or 1,000 or 10,000 pieces or whatever it may be. And that's kind of the point or the purpose of the opening statement, which is for me, Mr. Koger, to get up here and give you our presentation of what we think is going to come in the trial and what we're going to be talking about in the next week or two. So that's what we're going to do today. In addition, I think I need to tell you that this case is different than other trials. It's different, obviously, because we have 6 individuals that were murdered. We also have 3 different locations where the victims were ultimately located. Consequently, the state has a substantial amount of evidence and a substantial amount of proof that we have to present to you. It's not like a TV show where you're going to have one witness like Law and Order and they get lucky and he runs in at the last second and presents the evidence and they win the case. It's not what's going to go on here. Instead, you're going to hear proof about each of the 6 victims. You're going to hear proof about each of the 3 locations. The state will be calling several witnesses who will tell you about the murders committed by the defendant. Each witness the state calls to testify will add a piece to that puzzle, right? Each witness will have a different piece. And I can't promise you that we're going to start in this corner and work all the way down. Doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way in any case. It certainly doesn't work that way in this case where we have a timeline that goes here, but we have witnesses all on the timeline. It will vary. You got to stay with me. It'll make sense at the end, but as we go through it, you need to pay attention, and it'll make sense. Some witnesses will have large pieces to the puzzle. Other pieces will seem small at first, but when the state is through presenting its case, you will have the entire picture. You will hear from Lincoln County law enforcement, Lincoln County officers, Madison County, Alabama law enforcement, including officers, investigators, and detectives, other investigators from Tennessee, detectives from Tennessee, TBI agents from the state of Tennessee, medical personnel from the state of Alabama as well as the state of Tennessee, forensic scientists from Tennessee and Alabama. You'll hear from friends and family members of the victims, and you'll hear from folks who knew the defendant. You also hear from other individuals that were involved with this case and with the defendant and with the victims as the case plays out. For example, we're going to have video from a Walmart store. So you'll hear a custodian of the video from Walmart, a video from a Wavaho gas station. That individual will have to testify. All of this equates to a long trial with lots of testimony. But this also equates to a trial with substantial proof as to the guilt of the defendant. I simply ask that you stay with me, that you bear with us, that you go along with us, and you pay attention to the testimony, and you listen to the evidence. Take notes if you need to. It's a lot of names. It's a lot of facts. Finally, we'll ask that you apply the law that the judge will give you at the end of the trial. If you do that, and you apply your common sense, this will not be as difficult a case to understand as you're probably thinking it may be right now. And I hope you're not. It won't be. But it may not be until the end. As a district attorney, it's my job to see that the case is presented to you in the best process, the best manner possible, right? I have a team of assistant district attorneys sitting behind me. They've helped with that, obviously. But it's my job to make sure we present it to you in the best order and procedure that we can. All right? To do that, I was walking last night, had my headphones in, trying to think about how do you explain to a jury why you're going to hear so much testimony and so much evidence, and I can't put it on a this happened first, this happened second, this happened third. How do I explain that to you? Well, here's the example I came up with, so bear with me. If I asked you to come to my house, I said walk up on my front porch, and I want you to look inside the house, and I want you to look through the front door window, and I want you to describe my house to the judge. Tell him what it looks like. Well, if you stood on my front porch, you could look through the window and you could describe it pretty good. You could talk about the colors and the carpet and the front room and a little bit of the hallway and all that, and that'd be good. And that might be enough for the judge to say, oh, yeah, I know where Rob lives. It's right over there. But if you're going to do it right, you're going to then go to the next window, right? And you're going to look at that view, and you're going to see what you can find in those rooms. And then you're going to go to the back window, and you're going to go over here. And what you end up with is you're getting absolutely every angle of whatever it is you're trying to describe. So that's easy, describing my house. Well, what about 3 different spots with 6 murdered folks? It's a little bit more, all right? So that's why we're going to be here a while. We're going to be talking about lots of evidence, and that's why you got to stay with me, because the guy who's describing this view can't describe this view at the same time. So he's going to go first, then we'll give you this one. And at the end, we'll help you understand the timeline. And it won't be complicated at the end. It might appear that way as we go through it. Bear with me. Ultimately, it's my goal to present to you each and every available angle of this case and these murders so that you can say at the conclusion of this case that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Every aspect of what transpired in this case cannot be known beyond a reasonable doubt. Admit that to you up front. But there will certainly be enough evidence presented by the state in this trial for you to know beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of the 6 murders I described earlier. Each witness called by the state will be sworn to tell the truth, and they will all be subject to cross-examination by the defendant's lawyer. This means that the lawyer for the defendant will be able to ask any questions that he may want of our witnesses after we've concluded with our testimony. After the state has called all of its witnesses, the defense will have the opportunity to call any witnesses that he may want to call. The defense does not have to prove anything, therefore he may choose not to call any witnesses at all. If the defense does choose to call a witness, then our team, the prosecutors, will have the right to cross-examine his witnesses as well. After both sides in this trial have had their chance to put on the proof, each side will be given the opportunity to do something similar to what I'm doing now, which is make a closing argument. The state goes first in closing argument, then the defendant, Then the defendant goes next, and finally, because the state has the burden of proof, the state gets the last opportunity to stand up here and make the last argument to the jury. After all the closing arguments are done, the judge will give you your instructions. He will read you the relevant law that you'll need, and then you will go back to the jury room to deliberate. So that's the process we're going to go through. All right? Before I talk to you about what we believe the proof in this case will be, and I'm going to tell you in a second what we think the proof is going to show, I need to discuss with you at least two things. First, I want to talk about your common sense, right, and the right to use your common sense, and the state's request that I want you to use your common sense during this trial. What is common sense? Obviously, common sense is the information and the knowledge that you learned growing up, that you learned from your mom and dad, that you learned from your grandparents, that you use every day. I want to be very clear. Nobody in this courtroom has asked you to check your common sense at the door. You've got to have it, and the state will ask you several times to use your common sense. Ask yourself, does what's coming from that witness pass the common sense test? If you do that, it'll be very important to this case. So don't think for a second that you don't get the right to apply your common sense. You do, and we want you to every bit of information that comes out. Secondly, let's talk about types of evidence. And I know General Eubanks has already talked about it. I know the judge has talked about it, I think, on 2 occasions at this point. But you may recall General Eubanks during voir dire talking to you about direct and circumstantial evidence. Y'all remember that conversation? I think General Eubanks explained that direct evidence is evidence that a witness personally collected, observed, or identified, or evidence from a witness that personally perceived that information by means of a sense, smell, sight, touch, or any other sense, right? Now, the layman's term, obviously, of course, is the direct evidence is that you're the one who saw it, right? Or the witness is the one who saw it. And not necessarily saw it, it could be any of those senses. In other words, direct evidence can be from the witness who, I don't know, smelled it or touched it, right? General Eubanks also talked to you about circumstantial evidence. And this is very important, so I want to talk to you about it again briefly. Do you remember General Eubanks talking to you about circumstantial evidence during voir dire? If you don't, listen, we'll talk about it again. But General Eubanks gave you the example of a witness that was outside, saw it snowing, saw the ground become covered in white, then went inside and said, hey guys, it's snowing outside. That's direct evidence, right? In other words, if that witness had sat here today and told you as the jury, yeah, I saw it, it was snowing outside, that's direct evidence. She gave the example of the other witness that looked outside, saw the ground was bare, there was no snow on the ground, went inside the house for the night, laid down, went to sleep, got up the next morning, wasn't snowing, but the ground was covered in snow. So what would be the circumstantial evidence in that case? Well, that witness could testify that it snowed that night, right? Now, I want to give you a different example because I think maybe a different example will apply in this case a little bit. And I tell you up front, these are silly, but it'll make sense when we get to the end of the case as to why is that district attorney talking to me about a cookie jar. So let me tell you about a cookie jar. If you get into your kitchen and you had a cookie jar like my grandmother did, and she had the sugar cookies in there, little round ones with holes in the middle. If you looked at your cookie jar and it was full of cookies and you saw the little boy walk in, take the top off, put his hand in the cookie jar, eat all the cookies, put the top back on, and leave, if you saw that, you'd be a witness, right? And if we had a trial about who ate the cookies, who ate all the cookies, well, you could testify that you stood in your kitchen, you saw the little boy come in, you saw him take the top off of the cookie jar, and and you saw him eat the cookies. That'd be direct evidence, and that'd be great. As a district attorney, I'd say, that is great. Come testify for me. We're going to win that case about the eating cookies. All right? If, different theory, different case, you went into your kitchen and you put all the cookies in your cookie jar, and you put the top on it. Nobody else was in the kitchen. And you left. And as you left the kitchen, the little boy walked by you. And he went into the kitchen. And he was the only person in the kitchen. You didn't go back. You didn't watch him. You didn't observe him in the kitchen. But then a few minutes later, the little boy walks out. You walk in. Cookies are gone. Top's off the cookie jar. And you look at the little boy, and he's got crumbs all over his face. Cookie crumbs. Right? Then, could you come testify as to what you observed or sensed? Yes, you could. You would come and you would tell that story. You would testify about that. And you would testify that those were cookies, those were cookie crumbs on his face, and I saw it, and that's what I'm going to testify about. That is circumstantial evidence that the little boy ate the cookies, right? Shouldn't be any doubt about that. That should not be complicated. But it is important because that example about the cookie crumbs on the face is going to be important to this case because you're going to hear a lot of direct evidence, but you're going to hear a lot of circumstantial evidence, a lot. That if you apply your common sense to the circumstantial evidence, you'll know exactly what happened. But you got to stay with me and you got to follow it because at the end of the trial, I'm going to talk to you about how many crumbs do we have on his face. Because we're going to have them all on his face, every one of them. All right? While I'm on that note, before I turn to the last page, the proof is going to show in this case that the defendant, Zakkawanda Moss, has a nickname. He has a name that he goes by in his group. And his name is Face, F-A-C-E. That's why I kept reading that in the indictment. That's what people call it. So you just keep that in the back of your mind because when I'm talking about cookie crumbs and the circumstantial evidence on his face, that's what I'm talking about. Now that I've told you about how the trial will be structured, about why the trial will be structured the way it is, I would like to relate to you what the state expects the proof to show in this case. The state, as you know, has charged the defendant with 6 counts of first-degree murder. The proof will show that the defendant committed these murders. The proof will show that these murders were committed right here in Lincoln County, Tennessee. The proof will show that these murders were premeditated. That's to say they were planned. When the victims did not or could not tell the defendant where the drugs were, where the money was, or where the guns were, the defendant made the decision to murder 6 people. All of those facts and many other facts that you will hear about will show that the defendant either committed or is at least criminally responsible for all of the crimes he's charged with. And when the proof is over, the state will ask that you hold the defendant responsible for those premeditated killing of the 6 victims right here in Tennessee. All right, before I talk to you about the specific facts or proof that we think that you'll hear or we know you'll hear, I want to talk about the victims first. Victims first because, A, we've got a lot of them, and you're going to hear names, and you're going to hear locations and these type of things. And I think it'll be beneficial to you because it was to me to let's set out the victims first so I know exactly who we're talking about when we start talking about locations and events. And let me also be clear. When I've been using the word victims, I'm talking about people that were murdered. And by murdered, I mean shot in the head, shot in the back of the head at close range. I mean victims that were tortured before they were murdered. I'm talking about victims that had their hands tied, victims behind their back, victims who were placed in bathtubs to die, victims who were strangled, and a victim who was stomped multiple times to death in the living room of his home. So let's talk about the victims specifically. The proof will show that the following individuals were murdered right here in Lincoln County, Tennessee. I'm going to start with Amber McCauley. Amber was 21 years old at the day she died. Amber Deshae McCauley, born March 14, 1991. Amber died as a result of a gunshot to the right side of her head. You will hear testimony from investigators, detectives, and medical experts who will tell you exactly how she died, why she died, and what the cause of her death was. Amber was shot while she was sitting in a white Hyundai Elantra car, small car. Amber was murdered in the Elantra while she was here in Lincoln County, Tennessee. The proof will show that Amber's body was taken out of the rear driver's side seat of the Elantra. She was dragged through the garage of a house located at 3264 Huntsville Highway. I'm going to call that the Huntsville Highway house in the future. 3264 Huntsville Highway. That's the Huntsville Highway house. That's one of the three scenes. Amber was dragged out of the Elantra as she was bleeding through a garage at the Huntsville Highway house, and she was tossed in a closet of the Huntsville Highway house's garage and left to die. The proof will show that Amber was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time because she had just met Warren Crutcher and she agreed to go out with him, and she was with him that night, and they'd been to Warren's mother's house, and if she had been anywhere else, she wouldn't have been murdered. And the proof's going to show that she happened to be with Warren, she was in the way, so the defendant killed her. Victim number 2. Shabrea Rael Campbell, and I'm not going to write her middle name, but it's R-A-Y-E-L. Shabrea Campbell. She was 22 years old. Talk about Shabrea. Shabrea was born February 17th of 1990. Shabrea was murdered and left to die by the defendant because he strangled her and with her hands tied behind her back and placed her in her bathtub at her house, at the Huntsville Highway house, and she was placed in the bathtub to die. Shabrea was unique because Shabrea was 7 months pregnant. And you're going to see photographs of Shabrea later during this trial, and you're going to know that is obviously a pregnant lady. And you're going to hear testimony from medical proof that will describe to you that Shabrea was murdered while she was 7 months pregnant. Medical proof's going to show that she was 7 months pregnant with a baby girl. And that proof's going to show that the baby girl died with its mama. Obviously, right? So I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to write Shabrea and baby girl. Shabrea lived at the Huntsville Highway house. Shabrea lived there with her little boy. Shabrea had a little boy named Rashad O'Brien Ragland. I'm not going to write down Rashad. I'm going to write down Rico, R-I-C-O, because that was Rashad's nickname, Baby Rico. Baby Rico, when he was murdered, was 16 months old. Got pictures of all these folks. Pictures of Rico. Got a good picture of Rico. You're going to like it. He's a good-looking little boy. Rico died because this man, the defendant, came to Lincoln County looking for his drugs and his money, and when Amber McCauley got in his way, he killed her. Proof's going to show it. Then the proof's going to show he went inside the house, and he tortured Shabrea Campbell looking for his drugs and money, and she either couldn't or she wouldn't tell him where it was, so he killed Shabrea with her hands behind her back in the bathtub. And at some point, while the defendant was at the Huntsville Highway house, Rico got in his way. Rico got in his way, so the defendant took his foot and he stomped on it multiple times until Rico was dead. And you're going to see the photos of Rico in the living room with a pool of blood. And you're going to hear the medical proof about how Rico died from multiple blunt force traumas to his head and how he had no chance of surviving. Next victim. Next victim, different scene. Jessica Brown. Jessica Brown lived at 4 Foxwood Drive. 4 Foxwood Drive's on the other side of the Huntsville Highway if you were headed down the 231. Not far from the Huntsville Highway house, a couple of miles. Jessica Brown, when she died, was 21 years old. Jessica Brown was 21 years old, living in her house on 4 Foxwood Drive. Jessica Brown was murdered. She was strangled to death while she was in her bathroom at her house on Foxwood Drive. The proof will show that Jessica died from multiple ligatures to her neck that ultimately suffocated her. The proof will show that she was placed in the bathtub, and that's where she died. She was placed in the bathtub with her hands tied behind her back. Jessica fought back. The proof will show what she did. She protected her own baby, and the proof is going to show that the defendant fought with Jessica so hard, not only did he strangle her, but the cords into her neck. Went into her neck. You're going to see the photos. It's not going to be pretty, but you'll bear with us. Next victim, Warren Vincent Crutcher. Warren Crutcher. Warren Crutcher was 24 years old, and Warren Crutcher was found at the third location. Not at the Huntsville Highway house, not at Jessica Brown's house. He was found on B.H. Reeves Road, which is just across the state line in Alabama. Warren Crutcher, 24 years old. Warren Crutcher was murdered because he was shot 3 times in the back of his head as he sat in the white Hyundai Elantra. Remember that. Warren Crutcher was shot 3 times in the back of the head. The proof will show that Warren was murdered while he was in Lincoln County, Tennessee. But ultimately, Warren's body was not left at the Huntsville Highway House and was not left at Jessica Brown's house. Instead, the defendant took Warren's body somewhere else. He took it to a secluded country road in Madison County, Alabama. The name of that road is B.H. Reeves Road. The proof will show that that road is somewhat secluded, has no street lights or street lamps. There are only a few homes nearby, and Warren Crutcher's body was intentionally placed in a wooded or a brushy area off of this B.H. Reeves Road. And I'm going to ask you to apply your common sense to determine why Warren Crutcher's body was treated differently than the other victims in this case. If you apply your common sense, and if you listen to the evidence, the answer will be clear. The answer and the evidence will show that the defendant moved Warren Crutcher's body so as to make it appear that Warren Crutcher was involved with the murders. The other victims were left where they were, and his body was stashed away. The proof will also show that Warren Crutcher has 2 children, 2 kids, Vinnie Crutcher, Jr., and a little boy named Jaden Crutcher. 2 little boys, Warren's children. One was with Shabrea at Shabrea's house. That's the Huntsville Highway House. Shabrea, Huntsville Highway House, had Vinnie Crutcher. Jessica Brown had Warren's other child. That was little Jaden. Jaden was with Jessica at her house. Those 2 kids were not murdered. Rico, not Warren's kid, was murdered. Then Warren shot in the back of the head 3 times, and his body is moved, stashed in the secluded area in Madison County. The problem or the mistake the defendant made, the proof will show, is that utility workers from Huntsville happened to find Warren Crutcher. Happened. Utility worker's going to testify. I'm not exactly sure what word he'll use, but he went to pee, used the bathroom, and he found Warren's body. And that's why the defendant's sitting here. Now, let's talk about what we expect the proof to show. The proof will show that the defendant was involved in drug dealing and the drug business with other individuals in Huntsville, Alabama, including a man named Henry Burrell. This drug dealing included the use of weapons and included the use of physical force when needed and if necessary. The proof will show that as part of this drug business, these men had various locations that they would call their stash houses. And these were homes where they would hide their money and their dope and their weapons. The proof will show that the defendant targeted these homes because the defendant knew where Warren Crutcher hid his drugs and money and dope. He knew it. The defendant also knew that Warren Crutcher was pretty successful. He was making a lot of money. He was doing good in the drug game. He also knew, the defendant also knew that Warren Crutcher was getting out of here. He was done with the defendant and Henry Burrell and these other guys. He was moving to Atlanta. He was going to quit the game here in Huntsville, and the defendant knew that. Obviously, the defendant didn't like that very much. He also didn't like the fact that Warren made more money than he did, and he didn't like the fact that Warren had his own stash houses that the defendant couldn't get access to. So the defendant, along with Henry Burrell, decided they were going to get Warren Crutcher. The proof will show that Warren Crutcher kept his guns and his drugs and his money at the Huntsville Highway House here in Lincoln County. The proof will show that on Saturday, October the 20th, the defendant had discussions with Henry Burrell about his plan to, we're going to go get Warren Crutcher. That's on Saturday, October the 20th. The proof will show that the defendant was forming this plan to rob Warren Crutcher on that Saturday prior to the Sunday night, early Monday morning, that's the time frame, late Sunday night into Monday morning, weekend, when all the murders were committed. The proof will show that the defendant was willing to take any measures to get Warren Crutcher, including harming any of the women involved, any children, and Jessica Brown at her house. The proof will show that on Sunday, October 21st, 2012, Henry Burrell and the defendant were together that day to train their pit bull dogs. Moreover, the evidence will show that on Sunday, October 21st, Henry Burrell's girlfriend, remember this name, Henry Burrell's girlfriend, Angelie Hill, on that Sunday, she takes Henry Burrell to the Tractor Supply parking lot right here in Fayetteville, where he hooks up with who? The defendant. Then on Sunday, Warren Crutcher is out in Huntsville with the new girl that he's met, Amber McCauley, and you're going to hear from Warren Crutcher's mother, who's going to talk to you about Warren and Amber coming over and what happened while they were at Warren's mother's house. Crutcher and Amber went to Warren's mother's house that night. You will hear from Miss Crutcher. You will hear from Miss Crutcher about what they were doing and what they were wearing. Same clothes they were murdering. Warren was wearing brown camouflage overalls and a white shirt. Warren was wearing his white Nike high-top shoes. This is according to Miss Crutcher. Around midnight on Sunday, Warren Crutcher and Amber left Miss Crutcher's home so as to go and pick up two people. They were going to pick up Henry Burrell and the defendant. They were going to go pick them up because the defendant asked Warren Crutcher to come get him. Crutcher and Amber McCauley left together from Warren's house, Warren's mother's house, in the white Hyundai Elantra to pick up the defendant and Henry Burrell. By now it is the early morning hours of Monday, October the 22nd, 2012. The defendant with Warren Crutcher and Amber McCauley traveled in that Elantra back north to Tennessee. As they did this, the defendant and Henry Burrell demanded that Warren Crutcher tell them where Crutcher had stashed his drugs and his money. The proof will show that Warren Crutcher either couldn't do it because he didn't have any stashed, or he wouldn't do it. So, as this group arrives at 3264 Huntsville Highway, the Huntsville Highway house, the defendant shoots Amber McCauley in the side of her head as she sits in the Elantra. He then takes her body out of the Elantra while it is in the garage of the Huntsville Highway house. He drags it around the back of the Elantra and he dumps it in the closet. Now, what happens when you're shot in the side of the head and you're drug on the concrete floor? Bloodstain. Shows you right where they went. Shows the Elantra's tire tracks coming out. You're going to hear the proof from the forensic folks talking about all of that, including other things that they found in this case. Thereafter, the defendant continued in his attempts to coerce the information out of Warren Crutcher. Warren's still there. Amber's dead, but Warren's not. Moreover, because Warren Crutcher and Shabrea Campbell now at the Huntsville Highway house either did not or could not give him the information he wanted, the proof will show that the defendant sought out the most innocent victim of all, young Rico, who happened to be in the living room when the defendant wanted his drugs and money. You know what happened to Rico, and you're going to hear the medical proof. The defendant then decides to use a rope to strangle Shabrea Campbell. I've already told you that Shabrea was 7 months pregnant with a baby girl. This strangling of Shabrea is a further attempt to coerce information out of Warren Crutcher. The proof will show that the defendant then placed Shabrea in the bathtub of her Huntsville Highway house where she died. This is in Lincoln County. She died with her hands tied behind her back, feet in the air, in the bathtub. You'll see the photos and you'll hear the proof from the scientists and the medical folks. Thereafter, the defendant made the decision that he would go to Warren Crutcher's other house, which happened to be Jessica Brown's house. The proof will show that 4 Foxwood Drive is close in proximity to the Huntsville Highway house, and that that's where the defendant went next. The defendant and Henry Burrell wipe down the Huntsville Highway house and take the Elantra back to Jessica Brown's house. Once at 4 Foxwood Drive, Jessica Brown's house, the defendant goes in, he finds Jessica Brown, and he murders her. Jessica was strangled to death and placed in the bathtub just like Shabrea and left there to die, left there dead. While at Jessica's house, the proof will show that the defendant and Henry Burrell went through Jessica Brown's house looking for the drugs and money. You're going to hear proof about what her house looked like. You're going to see where her air conditioning vents were torn out, where her stove was torn apart, her refrigerator underneath had been torn apart, looking for the drugs and money. Thereafter, the defendant and Henry Burrell then take Warren Crutcher, put him in the Elantra, drive him from Jessica's house, and shoot him in the back of the head 3 times, killing him. After murdering Warren Crutcher, the defendant drives Crutcher's body to B.H. Reeves Road and places Warren's body in what you will see is a wooded and somewhat secluded, brushy, is my description, type area. You will hear the testimony from the utilities worker who will describe how Crutcher's body was placed, as well as the officer that later comes to inspect the body, as well as the investigators and the scientific folks from Alabama that come to look at Warren Crutcher's body as well. The proof will then show early morning, October 22nd, or shortly after midnight. Stay with me. Stay with me. Shortly after midnight that night, the defendant and Henry Burrell make a phone call to Henry Burrell's girlfriend. She lives here in town. And they ask Angela Hill to come to Huntsville and get us because we need a ride. So what does Angela do? Keep in mind, she just dropped them off at TSC earlier in the day. They had a vehicle. But they needed a ride in Huntsville because they changed vehicles, right? Angela gets in her car from Fayetteville, and she drives down to Huntsville to pick up the defendant and Henry Burrell. And she goes to the spot where they tell her they are. And they tell her to come get us at an apartment complex on Sparkman Drive. And they say if you come to the apartment complex, if you go up around the hill and you go to the very top, the very back of the apartment complex, that's where we are. You will find us there. She goes to the top of the apartment complex. The white Hyundai Elantra covered in blood is there. Henry Burrell and the defendant are there. They've got weapons, they've got gloves, and they get in the car with Angela. Before they get in the car with Angela, they actually tell her to back away from the parking lot where the Elantra was, and they ask her to go park in the other side of the apartment building. She does. They, the defendant and Henry Burrell, come from the Elantra, around the back of the apartment complex with the long guns, the cell phones, the pistols, the gloves, and they get in car with Angelique. The defendant left the white Hyundai Elantra at the apartment complex on Sparkman Drive, and you will hear testimony from the law enforcement officers that located the Elantra, that inspected the Elantra, and that processed the contents of the Elantra. You will also hear testimony from the law enforcement officials that inspected and impounded the dumpster located next to the Elantra. It's in the same parking lot as where the Elantra was parked. The proof will show that thereafter, Angelique Hill was told by the defendant and Henry Burrell to do certain things. They're in the car together, in Angelique's car. The first thing the defendant has Angelique do, this is Angelique's testimony, is to go to the Walmart down there in Huntsville on Sparkman Drive. So she takes them to the Walmart there on Sparkman Drive in Huntsville. And the defendant is in the car. And he asks the question first. He says, I'm going in, but I need y'all to check me out and make sure I'm not covered in blood. They say, nah, you'll probably be all right. So he goes into Walmart. And the proof is going to show he goes in with a debit card that does not belong to him. He goes into Walmart with whose debit card? Warren Crutcher's. And he tries to use the debit card at the Walmart ATM. You'll see proof of this. You'll hear proof of this. The debit card that he tried to use at Walmart did not work. But the proof will show that he's going to try again in a few minutes to use Warren Crutcher's debit card. So they leave Walmart. The proof will show that the defendant then instructs Angelique Hill to drive the man towards North Alabama, a place called New Market, Alabama. On their way to New Market, the vehicle travels along the road, Winchester Road. That's Winchester Road just north of Alabama A&M. You may be familiar with it. They are heading to the defendant's house, which is in New Market. To get to New Market, you go on Winchester Road. If you're on Winchester Road, just north of Alabama A&M, there's a brand new Wavaho gas station there. And the defendant has Angelique Hill pull into the Wavaho so that he can go inside and he can try Warren Crutcher's debit card again. He tries it. You're going to hear the proof. You're going to see the evidence about these acts that they're doing as they're traveling from the apartment where they left the Elantra all the way to Moss's residence. Angelique Hill will also talk to you about what the men, the defendant, and Henry Burrell were doing while they were in her car. I've already told you that the proof's going to show they get in the car with their guns, their phones, their gloves, and those items. Well, once they get on Winchester Road, Angelique Hill's going to describe how the men start taking the items and throwing them out the windows of her car. Throwing guns out, throwing magazines out, throwing other items out as they go down Winchester Road. We know Angelique's testimony is true because she tells that to law enforcement, and you will hear from those individuals from Alabama and Tennessee who go back where Angelique said the guns were thrown. They found the guns. We got the guns. We're going to show them. We got the magazines that they threw out. We got it. We're going to show you. Private individual was driving his kid to school. He notices a gun magazine on the side of the road. He goes back to his shop, gets his glove, picks it up, calls law enforcement. We've got it. You're going to hear from him. You're going to hear from the scientist folks down there in Alabama who, when they collected these items, they analyzed them, they processed them. And they're going to tell you what those results were as well. As they drove Winchester Road, they head and they eventually arrive at the defendant's house in New Market, Alabama. Thereafter, the proof will show that Angelique Hill and Henry Burrell dropped Moss off at his house. and the defendant stays at his house. Then Angela and Henry Burrell get back in the car, and they head home to Fayetteville. As they're heading home to Fayetteville, they're on Joe Quick Road. So Winchester Road and Joe Quick Road. As they're on Joe Quick Road, you're going to hear evidence about Henry Burrell throwing out his cell phones that he had used, and we're going to talk about cell phones in a minute, and all the other items, including a gun that he's throwing out of the car on Joe Quick Road. You're going to hear all that as well. In addition, the proof will also show that in the afternoon of Monday, October the 22nd, Henry Burrell and Angela Hill returned to the defendant's home to pick him up. This is the next day. When they pick him up, the defendant has 2 bags of clothes with him. The defendant, Henry Burrell and Angela Hill, go to a dumpster on Jonathan Drive there in North Huntsville. And they take the bags of clothes, they throw them in the dumpster. They're in a garbage bag. Then, after they dump the clothes, the defendant, Henry Burrell and Angela Hill, go to Henry's relative's house, and her name is Lily. So these 3 individuals are in a car the next day, and they go see Lily Burrell. She has an apartment there in Huntsville. You're going to hear from Lily. The next day, Monday, October the 22nd, in the morning, Vinnie Crutcher, little Vinnie, Warren's little boy, is still at the Huntsville Highway house, and he's awake, and he can't get anybody else to wake up. So you're going to hear the story. You're going to hear the testimony about how Vinnie has to get somebody to come get him, so Asia Towles, T-O-W-L-E-S, and some other folks get that information that Vinnie needs some help. He's home alone. He's there without adults, so they go and they get Vinnie. Asia Towles eventually calls Tennessee law enforcement requesting help because something is bad wrong at the Huntsville Highway house, and then you end up with a case with me standing in front of you, right? In this case, you will also hear from the law enforcement individuals that investigated this case after the victims were discovered. After they were discovered, the information and evidence that comes from the items that were taken. And when I use the word analyzed and processed, I'm talking about items that were taken, collected, and then some scientists, either in Tennessee or Alabama, did an analysis of what information can we get from that item. So you're going to hear from them. You will hear testimony from the officers that searched for the items that were thrown from the vehicle on Winchester and Joe Quick Road. You'll hear testimony from the Gary Stevenson, the private individual who found the item on Winchester Road. You'll hear testimony from the investigators and the crime scene officers that analyzed each of the different scenes, not just the victims. You'll hear from the medical experts that examined the bodies of Amber McCauley, Shabrea Campbell, Rico Ragland, Jessica Brown, and Warren Crutcher. You'll hear testimony from an investigator named Shane Stiles of Madison County who made contact with the defendant shortly after the murders. And you will hear about how the defendant reacted when Shane Stiles took him back to Winchester Road and took him to Joe Quick Road. You're going to hear about that. You'll hear testimony concerning items that were taken from the home of the defendant, including weapons, long weapons, or what they call long guns, cell phones, clothes, and other items. You're going to hear about how these items are linked to the defendant and to this case. You're going to hear testimony from the defendant's probation officer who told him he'd been charged with murder in Tennessee, and she's going to tell you how he reacted. You'll hear evidence presented by TBI agents, not just Agent Wesson, but others. You'll hear evidence presented by the TBI Crime Lab, including firearm information by a man named Alex Broadheg, DNA evidence from Laura Booz. Jennifer Spivey will talk to you about prints that were lifted at the scenes. And Linda Littlejohn will testify about what we call microanalysis, or the shoe prints and those type items that are related to this case. And after you have heard all of this information and testimony, you will have those views of the house. You'll have it from every angle I talked about earlier. And you will have an abundance of information, clearly enough evidence to find this defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But because I promised you earlier I would give you every angle, I'm going to give you something else. A man named Nick Christian works for TBI. Nicholas Christian is the technical services expert for the TBI. He took the cell phones that were seized or that were thrown out of the car or that were found in houses or the scenes or the Elantra, and he analyzed the cell phones. And he's going to talk to you about what the defendant and the other folks in this case were talking about. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. And what they were planning on doing, what they did, and what time they were having the conversations. The proof will show the messages exchanged by the defendant and others wherein the defendant discusses the events of this night. And again, after you've heard all that evidence, and after you've heard from Nick Christian, you'll have plenty of information to find the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But I'll give you one more, just to make sure. And we'll have Adam Eubanks from the Federal Police Department come up here, and he's an expert with cell phones, but he does a different analysis. Adam takes the cell phone information that belongs to each of these folks, and he's going to show you where the defendant was. Yeah, he's going to show you where they went. He's going to show you how Angelie tells her story and talks about the guns and talks about the defendant being with the Elantra at the apartment complex. He's going to say, yep, she was right there. And she drives down the Huntsville Highway. It's exactly right. And she's going to follow it. Adam, Detective Eubanks, is going to follow it all. He's going to give you every single crumb on Face's face you could ever want to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a lot. It's a lot of information, a lot of facts. That's why it's going to take a while. But you need every bit of it, don't you? Got to have every bit of it so that you can see it from every angle, because the defendant's lawyer is going to get a chance to make an argument. Not going to have an option. You're going to hear the info from every angle, because that's the way we're going to do it. You will hear ample proof to show that these 6 murders were premeditated. You will know that the order of events shows a thought-out plan by the defendant. The proof will show that these murders were committed in the correct jurisdiction here in Lincoln County. And at the end, we will ask that you return the only verdict that this evidence supports, which is a verdict of guilty for each and every one of those victims. You will have ample direct evidence, and you will have every crumb on his face that you will possibly need, beyond a reasonable doubt. Bear with me. Remember why you're hearing all this. Remember the order may not be exactly, but it's the best we can give it to you, and add it up. And at the end, you apply that common sense, you render justice. Thank you.
Mr. Cover, you care to proceed?
Yes. Good morning. Not expecting a response. And you don't need to take any notes while I'm talking. Because like you were instructed early on, what I say is not evidence. Mr. Carter has said the last hour. You haven't heard any evidence. You haven't heard any proof. I don't have a lot to say, but with respect to the proof we expect to hear, I would like to keep a couple of things in mind. Number one, it is a harsh case we're dealing with. There's just no two ways about that. It is a difficult set of circumstances. And clearly, I think the proof will show, these are all homicides. These aren't accidental deaths. These aren't suicides. And keeping that in mind, your primary job here is going to be to decide who's responsible for these. And there was a lot of talk early on about, face. Mr. Moss, the defendant, he did this, he did this, he did this. You're going to have to discern through this proof what is proof and what is speculation. And I would submit that a lot of the proof that's going to come in from this stand is going to talk a lot about the circumstances of the homicides, but probably not near as much as the defendant did this, the defendant did that, the defendant did this. I suspect there'll be very little proof of what actually happened, who is doing what. I think there will be proof that we are dealing with folks that are dealing with drugs. And the real relationship, I think you're going to see, is a relationship between Henry Burrell, that's a name that gets mentioned a few times with the state's opening. Henry Burrell's in the car. Henry Burrell's where everything is going on. The relationship here is between Henry Burrell, who's known as Henry, and Warren Crutcher, whose nickname was Teen. That's the relationship that you need to focus on with respect to this proof. While the concept of, it was spoken of some during voir dire, of criminal responsibility for the act of another, in layman's terms you might think along that as aiding and abetting. That's kind of the way to think about that in real simple terms when you hear that term. Even in that situation, the proof has to be that somebody is knowingly and intentionally involved in what's going on to be held responsible for it. It is not simply guilt by association, guilt by being somewhere, guilt by knowing somebody, guilt by having a relationship with somebody. That is not what criminal responsibility is. And so as the proof comes out, and that's right, there's going to be a lot of proof about a lot of things that are going on. You've got to put that proof in the context of what is it really proving and discern between speculation and proof. Now, the other thing that is mentioned and that we're going to be mentioning throughout the course of the trial is this thing of it happened here in Lincoln County. This is the jurisdiction. And the reason that's important is because there is a body that was in Madison County, Alabama. Now, if that homicide did not occur in Lincoln County, Tennessee, it's in the wrong court. Now, the state submitted that they have proof that the shooting of Amber Bryant, of Amber, occurred at the Huntsville Highway House in a car. And also that apparently Teen, Warren Crutcher, was shot in the car and then taken to Alabama. Here again, listen to the proof, discern between what proof is and what speculation is. It's not going to be an easy case. It'll be a long time. But again, as we started out, no sympathy, no prejudice. It's going to be a tough case. I understand that. We have legitimately what is really some very innocent victims here. There's no two ways about that. And we're going to listen to, I'm sure, some testimony from some family members, and it's going to be heart-wrenching. And that is just the way it is. No sympathy, no prejudice, and no speculation. Thank you very much.
You still good? Ladies and gentlemen, we've been at it for about an hour and a half or so. Do you guys need a break before we begin with the first witness? Let's take about 10 minutes. Okay. And let me admonish you while you're taking your break, do not talk among yourselves about this particular case.